to be able to host a memorial program for the professor, because he was so inspirational in the way that he addressed each of the issues in each of the generations that as I mentioned. He found a way to speak to all people. He found a way that he was able to address all ages. And I think that today we're suffering in a world where people feel they either are not able to speak enough, or that their voice continues to be defeated in every debate, in every dialogue or attempt at dialogue that might be had with someone who thinks differently than us. So one of the ways that I think that we can take on that emotional strength is to gird ourselves emotionally, make ourselves stronger emotionally with a pride in Jewish rights, Jewish identity, and our history and our ancestry as a conduit for how we can embrace our own experience of suffering, how we can address our emotions to others' experience of suffering, and how we can apply our interest in making a difference in people's lives, even when it doesn't impact our own, even when it doesn't focus on our own agenda. How can we figure out a way so that our agendas don't have to conflict? Right now, there are many different conflicts going on in the world, and it's difficult for people to sometimes feel like they have to choose sides. And that is indeed one of the psychological strengths, I would say, that Professor Wiesel had, which was that he could allow his mind to encompass and his heart to encompass so many different streams of thought, and do so in a non-competitive way. I think that's a tool of compartmentalization and really incredible listening skills. Professor Wiesel was one of the great listeners, and he taught every single one of us, his students, how to listen. In fact, he very much wanted to teach the world. I want to see if our slides are working now. Can everyone see my slide? Can I just get some confirmation?
Yeah, looks great.
Thank you so much. It was many years ago that Elie Wiesel, after being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, that he addressed the United Nations. And it was at that presentation on the anniversary of the liberation at the end of the war of the Holocaust. He stood in front of the audience and he spoke. The man who once stood before nations felt privileged. A teacher and a writer, he spoke and wrote as a witness to a crime committed in the heart of European Christendom and civilization by the brutal dictatorial regime, a crime of unprecedented cruelty in which all segments of government participated. I think it is crucial at this time for us to be able to enter into the history of Professor Wiesel's words that were intended to inspire all humanity, that we look at the uniqueness through which he addressed the Holocaust as the Jewish experience of suffering, but also as the epitome of the human tendency, capability, potential for brutality, for evil. I think that today we're watching streams of evil emerge around us, and in many ways it's still couched in much of the same idea. And yet those of us who are Jews feel so conflicted when speaking of the era of darkness. The witness encounters difficulties, and so do we. We, the witness, who have become the witnesses because we have heard them ourselves, as Elie Wiesel taught so many of us. That his words became obstacles rather than vehicles. The witness himself, yes, but so do ours. We're told that we are over-Holocausting the world. Unfortunately, Holocaust education actually causes more anti-Semitism in some arenas and in some ways than improving understanding of what it is to be a Jew in the world, that it is not our political alignment, it is not any specific skin color. It has nothing to do with the specific way that one practices. It has to do with our ancestral line and our heritage that we pass from generation to generation. That his parents passed to him from his generations before. And therefore, we inherit the same thing as Elie Wiesel because we become his witness and the witness to every survivor. Now, it's interesting that there are many second generation I know who are joining us tonight. I wish I could keep up with all of the comments that are coming in. But I know that we have also the challenge of finding our own words. What are Jewish rights when there are rights of other peoples being persecuted? How do we represent the past of the Holocaust with integrity and not belittle it, not turn it into some sort of joke that others can feel free to laugh at, such as wearing the SS uniform and saying it's no big deal. You Jews, as I've heard before, we've had enough of you in your gas chambers. Get over it already. I think it's an important thing to remember that he wrote not with words, but against words, and we are fighting a similar battle today. There are no words, my apologies. We hear his voice right now. We can see him standing there in front of all of the heads of delegations from all over the world and heads of state, and that there were no victims. What does it mean to be a victim? If he's saying the words, no words to describe what the victims felt when death was the norm and life a miracle. What I did with Professor Wiesel was to highlight an element of the Holocaust experience that I called momentary survival. And it was exactly that. Death was the norm and life was a miracle. And one of the unique elements of the Jewish experience in the Holocaust was that the norm was 99% real. And when we hear threats that Israel is committing some sort of genocide against a people, number one, it is so based on fallacy, but number two, it is so easily believed by the same people who become enamored with the idea that the Jews are behind coronavirus and that the Jews are behind every evil in the world. Still, whether you know it or not, his memory, the memory of every survivor, the memory of every victim, even the memory of every perpetrator who stood at the edge of a mass grave and who blindly and willingly, perhaps in laughter, perhaps drunken, but most certainly pleased to be able to eliminate the Jew from the world. His memory is part of yours as well. Because one of the things we have to remember is that Elie Wiesel would not have been Elie Wiesel had he not been young Eliezer, the young man from Sighet, Romania. As I mentioned before, my life here in the mountains, it's quite spectacular to have stood there in his town. I was even in front of one of the hills and I heard birds chirping as I hear them right now here in the land of Israel, where I know Elie wanted so much to be buried. And I felt as if I was sitting in the park that he describes in Night, and actually describes in other places as well, of the park where he sat with friends and they would learn Torah, because the appreciation for Torah was so deep, so ingrained in their identity. And today, Jewish identity has been torn apart in so many ways that we don't even know how truly to make sense of it. He once wrote a book entitled A Jew Today, and I wonder, wow, what amazing words he might have to share with us if he were with us to tell us about being a Jew today. There are many, many voices of leadership that are out there, some with wonderful intentions, some with politically driven intentions. And our goal must be to gain that emotional and psychological strength of the Wiesel, what I call the Wieselian method, that we gird ourselves strong and we seek out the questions that we can answer and the answers that lead to more questions. As he says to the world, I speak to you as a son of an ancient people, the only people of antiquity to have survived antiquity. And yet, interestingly enough, it is that very antiquity that continues to be threatened by pure and outright lies. That antiquity that had been so accepted, so respected for thousands of years, is now so easily dissipating amidst the pressure of that boiling pot that is happening all around us, fueled by the lie that the Jew has somehow stolen land, that we're the colonialist enemy. I remember being in my Middle East studies, intro to the Middle East class at Boston University, when the professor said, an expert in Egyptology, and she talked about, and then came the Zionist enemy. And it's fascinating to think that who was the first Zionist? He was Avraham Avinu, Moshe Rabbeinu. Zionism doesn't begin with Herzl. It begins with antiquity. The Jewish people, throughout much of its history, we have endured the exile and oppression. Oh, indeed we have. And our hope of redemption continuously led us always to Jerusalem. But as a young adolescent, not only did he see what no human being should have to see, but he continuously dreamt of Jerusalem. Imagine the juxtaposition of these two worlds. In some ways, people are being forced to divide their worlds right now, with the civil rights movement claiming some sort of ownership over what it means to be pro-Israel, to be a Jew, to be a Zionist. God forbid we should use the word. How about we should go back to understanding that we are Israel. We are Bnei Israel. We do have the right to that legacy of antiquity and the hatred that has followed us from every generation, in every nation, wherever we have lived, and culminated in the gas chambers of Sobibor, Treblinka, Chelmno, Belzec, and yes, of course, Birkenau. Because Auschwitz is the one most people know. But your job and Elie's legacy rests in our ability to know the names, to know the difference. What is a genocide? To see the triumph of political fanaticism and ideological hatred for those who are different. This quote, like many of Elie's quotes, can be easily manipulated by either political side to claim that the other is a political fanatist. However, we must find ourselves in a different space of mind. We must find the psychological strength to understand the uniqueness of different types of persecutions and to address each one in its own right. Of course, respecting human rights of all kind. You know, when Elie spoke of the multitudes of human beings humiliated, isolated, tormented, tortured, and murdered, we have to remember the distinctions that rest between the parallels that many attempt to make in their lies about Israel, about the Jews. There is no parallel. There is no moral equivalency. And there is no need even to try and pit the different causes one against the other. It is our responsibility to Elie, who has guided us and who will continue to guide those of us who seek it. It is our job to find a way to find more people able to speak eloquently. There's a few young individuals that I've become aware of who are really doing an incredible job of speaking out for Jewish rights. And it's fascinating to watch these young people emerge, names that maybe were unknown before, and we want more of those names because we need to know that they can distinguish between those who committed the crimes. What is an underworld thug? Education is not the only conduit, as we see our academic world being increasingly overcome by Jew hatred and stereotypes and generalizations and negativity, even when couched within the cause of social justice and tikkun olam. Oh, yes, Elie believed in Tikkun Olam very much. I wanted to play a recording of Elie singing Ani Ma'amin. Anyone who has ever heard him sing knows that it was moments of magic to hear him sing. So yes, the fear of the academic institution is really something that we do share in common, not with the Holocaust, but with the decades prior to it, where it was allowed to fester because nobody wanted to put a stop to it because it was freedom of speech. There's a fine line, and it is true that his question remains open. In those dark years, what motivated so many brilliant and committed public servants to invent such horrors? Can't we say the same about fake apartheid walls set up at universities all over the country? Don't we see that committing public crimes such as these and the libels, endless libels against Jews, Jewish privilege of Jews as white and therefore the masters of white privilege? These are sensitive issues and most people have no idea how to navigate the conversation. And so we continue to look to our masters, those who guide our intellect and our heart and our emotion. And we remember the uniqueness of certain elements of that time. Babies used as target practice. Do you see this happening? In the movement to abolish the only law enforcement elements that exist to help provide semblance of security in our communities? Do we see adolescents condemned never to grow old and parents watching their children thrown into burning pits? Oh no, it is essential that we draw distinctions because it is through the distinctions that we are more able to be effective in how we change the world and how we aim to inspire not only the young generation, but also our fellow moms, dads, grandparents, each of us stuck behind a screen, trying to navigate the confusion in the world, and yet nothing will compare for the intimate despair that haunted their days, not only during, but after. Many don't know that Professor Wiesel was actually responsible in many ways for the popularization of the term Holocaust to refer to this attempted extermination of the Jewish people and the persecution of countless others. I often ask my students the question, at what point might we have stopped the steamroll of hatred from becoming the Holocaust? Have you thought about it? Are we thinking about it now? Well, unfortunately, it's so today designated as who is Hitler and who is doing the worst crimes that we can't have an honest discussion, unfortunately, because of that political motivation. However, there was even political motivation when the Jews, yes, were pushed away from the shore, but the context and the background and the circumstances were indeed very different. Is it our job to compare the two eras? No, one is not necessarily worse, depending on who you ask, and depending on how we allow the future to unfold before us. Was Auschwitz in beginning, an end, apocalyptic consequence? Or was it the final convulsion of demonic forces in human nature? I want to make sure that I'm able to check for more questions. I just am getting a bunch of different comments here, and I just want to please remind you, any questions that you might have, please put them in to the Q&A so that I can address them in a timely manner while we hear Professor Wiesel's words echoing in our hearts and in our souls. Certainly not all victims were Jewish, but all Jews were victims. For the first time in recorded history, to be Jewish became a crime. Today, there are many that are making equations regarding the treatment of other peoples, wherever they might live, with the Holocaust. How are you able to effectively counter these arguments? What do you do? How can you find your words to help make sure that it isn't that it's only a Jewish story, it is a story for humanity, and it is our role to be the conduit between those who survived, those who were murdered, and the future? Is it fair, therefore, to accomplish what Hitler himself sought to do, to put an end to Jewish history? What's being done today by trying to erase the Jewish connection to the holiest place, the Temple Mount, and the last remaining wall, the Kotel, the western wall of the Temple Mount Plaza. You know, is it so easy to forget that the greatest temple that had embraced all peoples of all faiths, had it existed there because it has simply been destroyed and again and again? What has remained continuous is the desire of the Jewish people to protect our history and to not give up our identity in doing so. That was part of Elie's uniqueness. He never had to be ashamed of his being a Jew. How many people today are basing their positions on, well, I as a Jew, well, I can tell you, you can say I as a survivor many times as well, but there are no two experiences that are precisely the same. Just as there are many survivors who might have had a different voice than Professor Wiesel shared with the world, we too want to make sure that we are incorporating that voice of the witness and inheriting it, and that we do not create a world that is implicably, irrevocably devoid, not just of Jews, but of Jewish memory and of the Jewish voice and of the Jewish future. The killers come, and they're coming in too many places around the world. And we don't know how to respond because we don't want to overreact. We don't know how to respond because we do not want to believe that the killers are who they are, or that the victims are who they are. And I know that this is something that those who have been involved with the movement of Black and colored rights, and how all the different phrases that can be used, that we must use in order to ensure that we are addressing our fellow man, our fellow human being, as a fellow human being. This isn't about a skin color, but rather how do we as human beings accept one another as human beings? I'm sorry that it is so difficult to be so far away from what is happening in America, and to know, because the racism in different places in the world is actually very different, documented even as early as, I remember I read a testimony from the 1800s about the uniqueness of the interracial frictions in different countries. It's true, and we cannot create an equal sign across the board. And so therefore we have to figure out a way to take that strength, that understanding of who is the executioner, who is a victim. Perhaps we do not need to seek precise definitions, but definitions based on context, to be able to learn about the absolute evils that Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and all of the camps, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, the names you know and the names you don't, of over 49,000 camps, and all of those who were targeted there, because they can also whisper to us. How can we learn from the voice of the dead, not only the voice of the living? The voice of the living gives us their eyewitness account of the calculated and bottomless evil, cruelty, like we cannot even imagine. You know why it's important that they share with us those cruelties? Because so many elements of the Holocaust have become very poetic and emotional that we forget that those brutalities are what shed light on just how far someone will go to accomplish their agenda, like punching a 93-year-old woman in the street, in public, in broad daylight. No such behavior can be accepted. No such brutal evil should be allowed. But we need to be able to also distinguish between elements of evil and their cause. What is fueling it? Because otherwise, how educated, simple, law-abiding citizens, yes, they do fire machine guns, and they do take culture seriously, and they do ransack and loot and murder and target synagogues and claim that it isn't the government that they should be after, but the Jews behind the government. If you don't see these comments circulating in the social media, well, you know what? To be honest, you're lucky. Because when you see what is being circulated everywhere in the world, we realize how much we have forgotten and how much no one knows. No, Birkenau is not a beer. And it is not a drinking game for colleges. Do you realize this is what's happening around us? Some of them know what Auschwitz is because they had a very significant Holocaust education. Maybe what was missing was man's perception of Jews as human beings, just as it was missing for the Nazis. That sad, terrible fact is that the Western nations intervened a little too late, and we unfortunately know of the anti-Semitism that was very deep in certain elements of governments and countries all over. And some of those same leaders who were so admired are having their statues torn down by people who do not understand the reality of history. They do not understand the patterns of history, and that those who forget it are indeed doomed to repeat it. Isn't that a little bit of what we are seeing? Isn't that a little bit of what Elie maybe was noticing when he writes in Night about walking towards the train station and seeing the neighbors looking out of their windows? Is it a metaphor? And can we make sure that we are applying any lessons he gives us with integrity? We must do so from the same Jewish soul. As he once said, Jerusalem was the lullaby to him, to which he went to sleep. Where is Jerusalem in the hearts today? But a point of contention for so many, too many. How can we make sure that the scope of indifference towards our own destiny is not forgotten, that the indifference remains as a lesson that we can apply also to the indifference we might have towards our own justice, our own rights, our own pursuit of dignity, our own desire to make sure that the reality of momentary survival should never become real for anyone else. There are those who risk lives, and there are those who are risking their lives today. Not only our soldiers on the front lines here in Israel, but also those who are out there advocating for Jewish rights, for recognition, to be listened to be heard above the chaos of billions and billions of voices who are determined, just as Nazi propaganda was, just as anti-Semitic propaganda was decades and hundreds of years beforehand. So too, we have to raise our voice, just like in every generation. And remember, just as the Allies came too late, we, the Jewish people, Am Yisrael, we have to make sure we don't come too late to defending our rights and making a difference, to shifting the paradigm so that our children in the future will know joy only joy in their heart. No pain. But we can't say that that's true today. Our youth are experiencing more pain than any of us thought that they might. As a survivor has said to me, a dear friend said to me, what are they waiting for, to come home bloody at the end of the day? Of course, that survivor made Aliyah at the age of 67. So that, waiting his whole life, finally made Aliyah. But that's not the answer for everybody. And that's okay. And I say that as somebody who has picked up and moved and raising my wonderful family, my children here. And my family is far, far away, and that is hard. So we each have our role to play in this Jewish destiny, those from the land and those from afar. Perhaps only if we realize together, by overcoming the differences, our voices, the differences of our perspectives, the differences of our politics, the differences of our culture, then perhaps then we might actually be able to sing and to celebrate as we once did, and not recite Kaddish for the same people who call for our destruction, but instead to join together in the singing of what was the national anthem of the Jewish people, even before it was the national anthem of the state of Israel, where the Jewish people were reborn in our ancestral homeland. I know, sadly, too many who don't know the words by heart. And I think of the soldier who arrived at the Kotel at the 6-day war. And he said, I'm secular, I don't know what to say. And the other soldier says to him, say Shema, and he teaches him the words. Elie would say, Ani ma'amin, and many other different brachot and words of Torah and emunah, faith, that he would pass on. They did have just enough strength to recite Kaddish, and we must have enough strength to carry on the Kaddish of that time of liberation. What did it mean to be free as a Jew? It actually was not a moment of joy for most. And they spent their lives trying to overcome, and their descendants, the second generation of survivors, have spent their lives trying to understand and cope with those painful elements of their being raised by someone who had witnessed the universe of hell. And now it's the grandchildren and even the great-grandchildren who need to be guided, who deserve to be guided, who deserve to be inspired to share the story in a way that they do not need to universalize it. They do need to deepen it. They do need to make sure that they are the words of the witness, not convoluted in some universalistic manner, but like Jeremiah and Job, yes, their messages apply to people of all faith, but we, not only the world community, but the Jewish world, we all must not choose vengeance, and we must not choose hate. We did not. We will not. We must speak of our suffering as a warning. We must choose love, but we also must choose action. We must choose to make sure that when the victory came too late, it came perhaps just in time to be the lesson for the young generation of the Jewish people to have something that they could hold on to, they could glean from, that they could carry on. And here we are today, those descendants having established the most amazing Jewish world, strong, resilient, in every country, from Australia to England, to the United States, to Canada, and the list goes on. And in every single one of those places, Jews are now being attacked, maligned, and libeled. And many of us are afraid. It is not too late for today's children. It is for their sake alone that we must bear witness. It is for their sake that we are duty bound to fight anti-Semitism, to denounce it, racism, religious and ethnic hatred. Those words, hear them. And he knows that he is here with us as we remember him. He knows that it is our job to carry on, our ability to recognize the cults of death, not only those who preach the death of Jews, the death of Israel, death to America, death to the West, death to the whites, death to the blacks, death, death, death drives terrorism, drives the desire to bring balloons with explosives into the Jewish homeland and to throw Torahs in the toilet in Jewish houses of worship. That same cult of death, whatever they define themselves, wherever politically they stand, it is absolutely 100% our requirement to recognize the crime against humanity, not only general humanity, but the crimes against the Jewish humanity that we deserve to have protected in the integrity of how we carry on our memory, how we live our lives, how we embrace our nationalism, how we express it, how we advocate, how we might do it privately in the comfort of our homes, how we might secretly really wish that we knew more Hebrew songs that we could sing with our kids, and what a shame maybe that we didn't teach them more. But guess what? Now is the time to learn, because it's never too late to decide no longer to ignore the evil. And it isn't always about becoming a public advocate. And it isn't about identifying who has more privilege than others, but perhaps by identifying the privileges that we must share, that give us all collective strength, that allow us not to blur the past, but to see it clearly. This quote was pulled by Professor Wiesel's speech, that indifference always helps the aggressor and never his victims. Unfortunately, today, it's very difficult to identify who is the aggressor and who is the victim. But indeed, we must. And we must do so in calm, peaceful methods, because there is nothing that condones violence. There is nothing that condones any type of terrorism. And most of it is being purported simply by lies. I understand. Sorry about that. I want to be able to have some of these questions responded to that I know that people have asked. I was asked about the St. Louis, that there were less than 1,000 Jews that survived. Indeed, those who were on the famous St. Louis that had been turned away from the United States, most of them were sent back to Germany, and they did suffer greatly during the Holocaust, but many also did survive. This is a beautiful question that I think that Elie would love to have asked on this day of his memory. How did he ever find joy after all of his losses? You've really touched me with that one. I think that Elie found joy in every moment of life. He sought it out as a way to counter the despair that was inevitable for everyone who survived that world. That was inevitable when the nightmares continued to pervade at night. I think he found joy in every prayer he was able to say, even when, as he would tell me, even when he was in an argument with Hashem, he still knew that he could voice the argument. And he always said that he hoped, much like he writes in the Night about Moshe the Beetle, and he writes that, he hoped that he would be guided to ask the right questions. And I think he found joy in his questions. I know for a fact he found joy in his students. There are many of us all over the world who have studied at his classes. I actually got an outreach from a dear friend. I'm going to give a shout out to Gila Kassouf, who has carried on her legacy as one of Professor Wiesel's students by creating a theater in his memory, using his works. And she's the only one who has gotten permission to publish his works in a theatrical performance. And I'm just so honored to see these amazing efforts come out of students banding together and doing things in the memory of our great leader. He was a voice. And I think that for that reason, he was really seeking joy through his students and with his students, and very much in his exploration of how he could connect the past to the present and to the future. He would enter into our classrooms, and every lecture he gave, he said, "Okay, what did you learn? And what are you going to do about it with what you've learned?" It's been used now, of course, at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. But okay, we know what we've read. What did you learn? And how are you going to use what you've learned? And I think that was very much also a element. Oh my goodness, I'm told that my voice is very low. That's the first time I've ever heard that. I'm sorry if there's a technical difficulty, but I apologize for that. So are there any questions that I can answer for anyone else? I saw someone raise a hand here as well. And let's see. Okay, so I have another question here, which actually was sent to me privately, that if Elie believed the world remains the same, then what can we really do to change it? And I think that there's something to be said for that. I think that we have, I'll share it this way, actually. The professor and I used to sit together very often, and he would say, and I would say to him, he's the great mystifier. Because he would always say, one who was never there could never understand. And I said, but Professor, my students say to me, if we can never understand, then why should we bother? Well, I think that this quote of the professors that I'm showing on the slideshow, right now, I think that it very much demonstrates that we have to lift our eyes from the ruin, and we must tell the tale, and we must figure out how we can help people not understand the Holocaust, but how can we give people a portal of entry? My work that I do with Israel Forever Foundation, that's what we try to do. We try to give people a portal, and Professor Wiesel was quite supportive of the work that we're doing, and absolutely remains part of the inspiration for the vision that we have here at Israel Forever, of what does it mean to be a part of Israel, the nation, the history, the heritage, the beauty. And so I think that if we can't understand elements of the Holocaust, we have to understand the elements of the human experience. As I mentioned before, that it was experienced so differently by different partners and individuals through the context of the historical events. And each historical event targeted a different community. So therefore, when you look at the Jewish experience, we have absolutely every right, and we have our obligation to specify those uniquenesses, because if not, then it becomes co-opted by illegitimate parallels set only against the exact same platform and based upon the exact same platform as the Nazi agenda itself. And people who say otherwise, or say that we have to forego that, their anti-Semitism because, we like the other parts of their platform. Oh, no, my friends. No. Elie Wiesel is begging us all, stand up and find a way to use your voice. You have a voice. I am going to invite you all to use your voice with me. That is for sure. I see two people have raised their hand, and I have absolutely no idea how to do that. Ariana, hopefully you can help me here, that we've got some people who want to ask something, because this is our chance, and I'm happy to do webinars all the time, but who wants to see my face all the time? We're here because it was that face, that face, those eyes, and that calm. By the way, the question that you had asked about joy, Elie had a great sense of humor, and he loved to laugh. He also loved raspberry rugelach, but we all have the things that are our indulgences. Okay, wait, I'm trying to figure this out. Just 1 second. I see that they're I'm in the wrong one. Here we go. Okay. How do I explain Jew hatred by Jews themselves? Oh, what a wonderful, oh, Carol, thank you so much for joining. I think that there have been in every generation such Jews who do such things, where they, find it challenging to align themselves as a Jew with Jewish values that are somehow not directed to that message of Tikkun Olam, the idea that you have to fix the world. We forget that it is rooted in our own Jewish connection. Now, someone like Bernie Sanders or organizations such as If Not Now or J Street or others that are truly anti-Israel movements, and they're seeking the destruction of a Jewish sovereignty in our ancestral homeland, I think that it's important that we recognize that they are also in many ways very proud Jews, and that's the basis for a lot of the inner conflict that Jews are feeling. I actually don't agree with Israel, but I feel really proud as a Jew. So it's no longer just the issue of self-hating Jew, because they sometimes have this very proud and out Jewish identity. Unfortunately, however, that Jewishness is defined very often more as their religious identity. Interestingly enough, by the way, it is in the early 1930s in Germany, you actually had the Jews were referred to as Germans of the Mosaic faith, because Jewish meant Jewish, the faith, the religion you practice. But no, we are Jewish, meaning we can find however we want to define ourselves as Jews. We can express it this way. You can keep Shabbos. You can keep Shabbos 98%. And you know what? Yes, there are going to be people who are going to judge you, but we can do nothing about that because we live in human society and everybody is judgmental. Can we get past it? Doesn't seem so. But the only way to do so is to learn and to seek out the questions and then find the answers. And don't accept the lies, because I'm telling you, those of us who are out to pursue truth, we are few and far between when it comes to comparing us to the numbers of those who want to distort, exaggerate, delegitimize, dehumanize the Jew again. I see that there's a question about the uprising of white nationalists who hate Jews. I'm going to be honest with you. This is, again, not owned any longer by a single movement. It is from every direction, from every political stream, every religious stream. We are talking about logical Jew hatred. Logical Jew hatred. It is emotionally driven, but they have, as a result of the garnering of massive numbers, and again, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, sometimes they're called, you have Antifa, you have the Muslim Brotherhood, you have Black Rights Matters. Listen, Black Lives Matters, Black Rights Matters as a movement, absolutely, yes. Black Lives Matters as an organization has a violently anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. So therefore, it's just, I'm sorry, say that again. My audio is problematic.
Yeah, something happened to the.
Okay, well, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I apologize again. We can continue with our questions here. I want to address the second one, Linda, that you've asked rather than the first, and then the first one that you asked here, that, you know, a modern Holocaust can be attempted again. It's not going to look like what it looked like. And so everybody needs to stop trying to find exact parallels. We have to look at some of these elements that Elie exposed in terms of how do we identify the real victim. I always teach when I'm training students on fighting Holocaust denial or anti-Israel activity or anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, in particular anti-Zionist activity as well. Very often you keep asking the questions of that person and you'll push them against the wall and you'll expose that the root of their ignorance, well, the root of their hatred is ignorance, and usually it's based on ignorance about Jews. So again, we're seeing that issue, and it doesn't matter if it's white nationalists or whatever party it is, but unfortunately, it's across the board. It is frightening. And what would Elie Wiesel advise? I will never, never attempt to speak for the great man himself. What I do believe is that he does not condone violence, and I think that massive rioting and looting at a time of a pandemic is just a unnecessary, ironic ploy of some kind, and he would call it out. He would call it out. However, today, again, what's the dilemma? Who are we calling out? Who we call out is going to be based on who your political alignment is with. My hope is that Professor Wiesel would not have taken a side, actually, and would have continued to be the voice of our moral conscience, the compass by which we could gain guidance. So I hope that the types of messages that I'm able to share through the work that I'm doing and some others are doing is really the work that we can all be doing, which is how do you speak to the common person? Because we can't all speak to dignitaries. And nobody wants to talk about issues because, you know, I shared that I don't see a person's skin color because we're not white, they're not that, like, what is that? I don't personally believe it. And I was therefore told that I was a racist and I was ignorant. So, you know, everybody's going to attack today. Elie once said people only want to listen so that they can respond. They're not actually hearing. And Elie believed very much that he needed to be the conduit for teaching students how to listen. So I think that what he would advise is let's listen deeper, and maybe let's expose some of the trends in mainstream media that have become much as they were in the 1920s in different places in the world, including the United States, were very anti-Semitic. And so I think that we have to be careful. We have to be aware, and we have to use our time as wisely as possible to truly find the avenue of change we want to be in the world. Not everything needs to be with the rallies and the cliches and it doesn't need to be that way. We need to affect real people. We need to affect moms of 3 kids still being homeschooled and loving every minute of it. And my kids, of course, know so much about Elie Wiesel. It's like he's their grandfather. But no, our grandfather is in Washington, in Maryland, and we are missing them terribly. And even he, a great leader in the Jewish world, along with my children's grandmother, another great leader in the Jewish world. Unfortunately, it's not a lack of leadership that we have only. It's a lack of the ability of the leadership to get over their differences and to speak. And it's a lack of the ability of the people to recognize and accept a leader's decisions. Elie was a leader, and people would hear him. And people would respect his decisions. People don't respect even the leaders we have, and I don't think that we can identify easily who leaders are anymore. I write a lot about leadership. I'm frustrated with the lack of leadership, but then again, I'm also frustrated with the fact that almost all of my students nowadays, nobody knows who Elie Wiesel was. If they have heard of him, they did read Night, usually for a literature class, almost never for a history class, and do not know, and no offense, because I love my students, and you all know that if you're here joining me, but could you stand up against somebody who says the Holocaust is a lie? Well, that's no longer the way that they're doing it. They're saying other lies. They're demonizing and dehumanizing us in other ways. Elie once said, "Forgetting the dead is akin to killing them twice." We will never forget the dead. Can we also make sure never to forget their messages? He was our guide, and he is for many, was for me a Rav. He was an inspiration in every way, even when it was challenging. And he taught me that we have to face our challenges and we have to find our strength, even when we are lost in the trees. I'm going to review real quickly a couple of other questions. Why are Jews considered and treated as the other, even today, in not so obvious ways? I'm going to tell you what, Linda. I'm going to be planning, I was asked to put together 3 webinars on anti-Semitism that I hope to be announcing in the near future. So I'm going to save that one because it's a very important question and it has very important responses. It is like the hatred of today. Unfortunately, there is a logic. It's ugly. Nobody wants to see there's a logic to hatred that makes no sense. It doesn't mean it's your logic, but somebody else makes it logical. I want to, let's see, he would have loved, how would he want us to stand up to those we know and have loved but disagree with? Oh, you know what? That's so true. The issue is even worse in families because I know people who just don't even speak to their families don't speak to them because they made Aliyah or they didn't change. I have one friend who told me that her sister unfriended her on Facebook because she wouldn't change her profile photo to a black box. I guess that's a thing. I'm sorry if I'm not, so in the know all the time on everything, but there are lots of movements that are smelling like the Third Reich, and that's why I mentioned in Linda's question, we could go white, we can go black, we can go yellow, we can go green, we can go, I can go in every direction, and we can find a source, and the source comes from the oddity of the Jew. And only when a Jew will take ownership of the oddity, and part of that oddity is our amiyut, our peoplehoodness. I hate the word peoplehood personally, but it's the only one we really have. It's not nationalism, because then people associate it with nationalism. Okay, you know what it is? When Jews used to go up and down the trains in Europe, they used to walk by. My students have heard me share this story because it's one of my favorites. They used to walk up and down the aisles and they would whisper under their breath, Amcho, Amcho, Amcho. Yiddish accent, of course, and depending on where you came from, which Yiddish accent, but the meaning is the same. Amcha, your people. And then they knew they could sit down and they could have a good conversation. There's also a joke circulating that on one of those trains, of course, somebody was watching another guy reading a newspaper, sitting across from a guy saying, reading a newspaper by the haters. He says, why are you reading this stuff? And he says, because if you read the Jewish news, everything is so negative. It's so depressing. But you read the things that the other people say against us, about us. We own the world. We're successful. We're so great. If only we would think that way about ourselves, but without hubris and without ego and with the utmost of humility. And I must say, by the way, that is something I also believe Elie would condone. He would say no to those who are using Kaddish for a purpose absolutely against Jewish faith, or those who are declaring fast days for non-Jews, which is actually forbidden in Judaism to do so. And for those who are willing to utilize the symbols of the Holocaust to demonstrate modern day movements, humility, integrity, dignity, and how we represent ourselves and present ourselves, and how we sometimes also know that we can talk between ourselves. Amcha, Amcha. Are we finding our discussion companion for our train ride or our Zoom ride, whichever one it may be. I understand my volume is gone again. My goodness, I am so sorry. I really do hope that most of these questions, if you're able to hear, I will be glad to answer some of these in another webinar. It looks like we've got quite a few more, and I've gotten some privately. But we're coming up on over an hour, and I think that at this time it would be fitting to encourage you to read something new by Elie Wiesel. Or if you haven't read Night, pick it up. And if you have read Night, then come and read my essay, of course, on the value of it, because it's increasingly being taken out of schools. That's another way you can make a difference. I don't believe that Night is the only memoir, but there are certainly a power in the way that he shares his words. And I am welcoming anyone to be in touch with me directly. If you might like to have a conversation on a topic of interest to you, I just want to say thank you, not only for your patience with our technical difficulties, which I promise hopefully will be improved for next time, but also for your interest and for your connection and for your commitment to memory, to Elie Wiesel, to the future, and to every single thing that we hope for and for the thing that every single one of us, every single one of us hope for the future, which is peace. May we all experience today and every day a little bit of the peace that Elie Wiesel brought to the world. Thank you so much for joining me today, and do keep your questions coming.